Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our latest edition of Fireside Chats. So I'm Pallavi. I am the co-founder of Asian Pathfinders, along with my colleague Shreyas, who is the co-host. And he'll also be the moderator of this session. But before I pass on to Shreyas and our speakers, I'll just give you a brief about Fireside Chats and Asian Pathfinders. So just give me a second, please. Perfect. So good morning. Like I said, we are Asian Pathfinders. We hold these weekly fireside chats on Saturday morning at 11 a.m. So today's topic is India's public policy landscape, past, present, and future. For that, we have Gitika Ahuja and Kumar Shubham. Uh, Shreyas will be doing the introductions, so I'll leave it to him for that. So about us, we are a knowledge sharing platform for scholars, practitioners, uh, researchers to come together. And the whole idea is to have a place for everyone to have an informal dialogue, discussion about a lot of different topics. So we believe that we need to have multidisciplinary approach to our work, our research. And I think that's one of the guiding principles that we go by. And it's just a way for not only people to just listen, right? We always encourage everyone to put their questions and comments in the chat section and definitely engage on social media with us. Uh, and any other ways, do reach out to us. If you have ideas, please, because we are a community, we are not a very specific, rigid organization. So we always welcome comments and questions and suggestions from everyone. So how do we execute this idea is obviously we hold these weekly fireside chats. Post this session, the videos are on YouTube. You can find the link in the chat section for all our social media handles, including YouTube. And we do have some exciting upcoming projects. So watch out this space on our social media pages where we will be definitely putting up all these projects. So these are just the basic focus areas that we look at. It can range from a very vast area, from politics to crisis management. So climate change, we've had 3 sessions on climate change. We have had sessions on terrorism, we've had sessions on energy security. Today we have it on public policy. So definitely, so one of the things we are very excited about is from next week, we have a pioneer series where we have people from pioneers from various fields in India. We have Dr. Anil Kakodkar, who used to be the former chairman of Atomic Energy Commission of India. That session kicks off next Saturday, and the link for that session is in the chat section. Do register. We're definitely looking forward to it because Dr. Kakodkar is one of those foremost nuclear scientists in India. He was part of India's uh, the nuclear tests that we've done. He has been the director of Bhabha Atomic Research Center. After that, we have Dr. M.S. Valiathan. For the ones who do not know about him, he is India's one of the foremost cardiac surgeons. He's also credited with the development of artificial heart valves and a lot more other things in biomedical research. If you just Google any one of them, here, all the speakers, you'll find pages and pages of them. And we're really, really honored to have them. After that, we have Dr. A.S. Kiran Kumar, who obviously a lot of us know was the chairman of ISRO. We have after that Dr. Shrikant Paranspe, who is a professor at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, University of Pune, and he is a known scholar on India's strategic thought. So that's there. So like I said, these are upcoming sessions. Dr. Kakodkar will be speaking on atomic energy and self-reliance. He has been a big advocate of this, so definitely watch out for that session. After that, we have Dr. Wali Hathan, A.S. Kiran Kumar, Professor Shrikant Paranspe, and the topics are listed. So just the community guidelines, I know we all are mature individuals, so we don't need that, but just that respect the view of others, but please don't shy from expressing yourself. It is for everyone's benefit. But definitely one of the things which we are very, very strong believers of is respect intellectual property. If you want to use any material or you want to quote the speakers, reach out to them and ask them for their permission. If you don't know how to, write to us. You have our email addresses. And obviously, I know sometimes debates can get very political and very heated, but let's keep it in a parliamentary language, not Indian parliament kind, but a really, really parliamentary language. Do not post defamatory, abusive content, strong statements. If you do, unfortunately, we'll have to remove you. So that's there. And as a disclaimer, please remember that the views expressed by the speakers here are just of their own and not of any organization that they represent. They are speaking in their personal capacity. So if you want to find any me, Shreyas, or Fireside Chats, these are our Twitter handles, our social media handles. So I am going to stop speaking and I'm going to hand it over to Shreyas to introduce and to Kritika and Kumar.
Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today morning at 15th session of Fireside Chats. And to take us through today, past, present, and future of India's public policy and landscape, we have two eminent speakers, Geetika Ahuja and Kumar Shubham. So Geetika has worked with Haryana government to design strategies for streamlining public service delivery and to improve state bus transport under CMGGA program, that is Chief Minister's Good Governance Associate Program. She has also led the fundraising strategy for the same program. Prior to CMGGA, she has worked with central and state government on various subjects, including evidence-based policy making and creation of conducive policy environment for businesses. Currently, she is a deputy manager at CMGGA program, and she is also a UN Local Pathways Fellow representing New Delhi. The second speaker is Kumar Shubham. Kumar is a co-founder at Rashtram School of Public Leadership and former director of Vision India Foundation. He has previously worked with multiple MNCs to develop tech products on education and health before switching to the public policy space. And more interestingly, he has developed a simulation card game on politics called Manifesto. So I'll just hand it over to Geetika rather than taking more time, because we have a simple format, as most of you know, that speaker will speak 40 minutes, 20 minutes each, and then we will have a question and answer session. You can pose your questions, share your questions in chat box, and during the question and answer session, which will be for 20 to 25 minutes, I will read out to the speakers. And you can direct your question each speaker or in general. So Geetika, over to you. Geetika, you have to unmute yourself. You're on mute.
Yes. Thank you, Shreyas. Very good morning to everyone and welcome to this Fireside Chat. Before we begin, if I may just ask Kumar to share the PPT on the screen.
Yeah, Geetika. Is it visible?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Kumar. We're very excited to see this kind of interest in today's session, and we're really hoping to have a very meaningful and interactive session. So please feel free to drop in your questions and comments in the chat box. And once we're done with our discussion, we'll take them up for sure. So to begin with, right, the topic for today has the words public policy. And as soon as we hear the words public policy, I think predominantly the image that comes to our mind is the government doing something for the citizens. And as citizens, we have a really long wish list of what all we want the government to do for us. So just picture yourself in a pre-COVID world and imagine yourself going from your house to your office. Example, you're just taking your bike and you're going down the road and you get stuck in a pothole on the street. And you go like, the municipality really has to fix this before the monsoon menace begins. You go take a bus and as soon as you pay your ticket, you feel like the price is so inflated, the government really needs to subsidize public transport more. And then you go sit in the bus next to someone who's just binge watching content in a pre-COVID world, of course, on TikTok, and you go like, the government really needs to regulate online content production. So basically, as citizens, our knee-jerk response to any troubles we face is that the government needs to fix this. If you could move to the next slide. Which begets the question, what all is the government in the business of doing? And what all should the government really be doing? And these questions become the basis for determining what kind of policy is made in the country. And in India, honestly, at different junctures, the government has engaged with multiple sectors and multiple capacities. And this ranges right from managing airlines to managing temple boards. So it's across this spectrum. But I want to share my most favorite and most bizarre example that I've ever come across. So there used to be this post in the Chief Secretary's office in Tamil Nadu called the CCA. And the rumor around this post was that it means Chief Confidential Assistant, because no one really knew what this post was about or what that person was really doing. So there was this huge conjecture around this post, right? And upon inquiry, it turned out that this is not Chief Confidential Assistant, but something called Churchill's Cigar Assistant, a post that was created back in the day when we were under the British rule, and Churchill really needed a supply of cigars, and the Madras governor decided that we can supply that to him through Trichonapulli, and that is how it started. And no one, including the CS, had any idea that something like this existed. The entire mandate of the post was to source the cigars and send it to the British PM at 10 Downing Street. And this continued much, beyond our independence, much after the British exited the country. This went on till 1965, till this discovery was made. And mind you, this was using public funds. So what I'm trying to get at is public policy is impacting every day of our life, and it's concerning all of us. Which is why the topic that we're talking about today, about the past, present, and future of public policy in India, holds a lot of relevance for all of us, because it enables us to ask some very key questions, which is, where do we come from? Where are we currently, and where are we going? But going back to the question that I posed earlier, what should the government really do? There is no simple answer to that, but honestly, it depends on states' capacity. But if you look at the next slide, we'll see that there are three key things that any government at minimum should be doing, which is revenue collection, public goods provision, and maintenance of law and order. At this point, I'd really like for Kumar to give us a contemporary example and explain public policy a little better.
Thank you, Gitika. Thank you for beginning the session with such an interesting story or an anecdote about something that we see all around us, from the lawyers wearing black coats in the top tropical summers to people going and referring to the judges as lordship. We see the examples of a legacy of policy being around us. But for me, the journey of policy was a little different. When I told my parents that I want to join the policy world, the first example that my dad has to offer was that his friend is also in policy. What he meant was an LIC policy, which is the most contemporary example of the policy. From there, we have evolved to a world where we can discuss chief secretaries, and the audience is expected or will somewhere be aware that chief secretary is a position in the central office of a state government. But the core idea, the core question still remains: what is the idea of public policy? Let's begin that, as Gitika mentioned, with a contemporary example, and that example, they don't have a better example than the current GDP discussion that is ongoing. The GDP is down by 23.8%. It is one on the higher side of expectations. People were expecting it to be somewhere around 15 to 20% down. It is 25% down. And the original numbers might be higher because a part of this GDP is estimates, which is an estimate based on informal economy. The manufacturing sector is down the highest, 40%, mining is down, construction is down, and a host of other sectors are down. Except agriculture, all other sectors are down. What are the key reasons behind it? So one primary reason that comes to the mind is the COVID-19 situation. The second reason is that economy was already down. The bigger question in front of us is, what can we do about it? As citizens, as well as people who aspire to be in the public policy space, the question that haunts all of us, and the question that hovers all around our mind, that disturbs in our sleep, that comes in our breakfast discussions, that comes in our calls with our friends. The question is, what can we do? Now, this is a mess that we are in an economic, financial, social mess. What do we do to come out of it? Throughout this session, we will keep discussing various means and ways to go through this question in different dimensions and look at it from a lens of time, that different time zones in India's history, what would they mean to answer this? How would they differ from each other in the form of how the society expects the government to be doing? What Geetika mentioned, what should the government do and what is the role of government in cleaning up this mess or creating this mess? To go through all this, we first need to understand the broad idea of public policy, the broad context of public policy. And that what brings me to the discussion, to the definition provided by Thomas Dye, one of the most popular definitions of public policy. Public policy is whatever the government chooses to do or not to do is public policy. So if your taxes have not increased in this year, it is a public policy decision. If the governments decide that the taxes should be increased, that's also a public policy decision. If the governments decide to patch a pothole that Geetika just referred to, that's a policy decision. If the pothole is not repaired in this financial year, that's also a policy decision. That gives some context to policy, but of course it's much more nuanced, much more deeper. But contemporarily and overall, as a generic framework, government does not do, makes the whole stream of public policy. Let's take some quick examples and discuss how governments approach a particular problem. So this is an example from Mysore in Karnataka. I can see some people who would be aware of this example. So Anushka, Ashar, and Prasad, please don't answer. Other than that, everyone can answer this. So this is a question that came in to a person called Dr. R. Balasubramaniam. He's a personal mentor to me and the author of I, the Citizen. He has referred to this example in his book, a brilliant book on public policy. So he mentioned that when he joined the government as a doctor, and then he got his first posting in a rural part of Mysore. And when he went to the village, he saw that women had to travel long distances during journey to go and fetch water from a nearby stream. This used to take 3-4 hours of their precious time of the day and used to be very tiring because they have to go through various jungles and thin and narrow streets, narrow pavements across the jungle. The doctor went to the city and asked the district collector, the babu of the place, that why don't we get some hand pumps installed in the village? And after 2-3 months of enduring follow-ups, there are 3 hand pumps now installed in the village. The doctor decided that I will not visit the village for a couple of months so that the people can reap the benefits of that. And then when I go back, I will get a hero welcome that I finally saved the village from the enduring efforts that they had to bear. The doctor decides to wait for a couple of months and then goes. And when he enters the village, he is suddenly welcomed with a lot of brooms. He gets a good beating from the women of the village. They're all shouting on him. Some of them women started beating him. He's a young lad at that time. This is a story 30 years back. And this is suddenly disturbing for him that I was expecting to be honored with garlands and what is happening around. Then he gets an answer, and then he says that this was a big turning point for him to leave the profession of doctor as a full-time thing and start pursuing the profession of being a development activist from there. What might have happened? Why was he not welcomed with garlands in the village? Any quick answers? You can just unmute yourself and speak, or possibly raise your hands, whatever is preferred.
You can share your answer in chat box also.
Yeah. Any quick answers? So this has to be a guess. You need not be right here. Okay.
I have a guess. I know there are.
Yeah, Pallavi, please go ahead.
There are 2 because Charuvati said because the pumps, the women had to work much harder. There was no waste, just the hand pumps installed. My guess is the women, it was a social event for the women to go. The hand pumps made it easier and it was closer, so that social event was reduced for them of getting together.
Right. So the pumps, if you look at the life of a woman in a village, they're mostly restricted to their households. That's the most of the time goes into taking care of their in-laws, taking care of the family, taking care of the children, taking care of the household responsibilities, sometimes going to the field and working along with the family members to ensure that the production is up to the mark. But no time with the women amongst themselves. There is no women meetings for that matter. That was the only time they could spend with each other. Thankfully, to the movie Toilet Ek Prem Katha, this story also got a lot popular, and now we understand that how we should not impose our ideas of development to them. Let's move to the next story. The next story is from Bandra, Mumbai. Anyone in the audience from Mumbai?
I am actually.
I am.
So, okay, so good number of people, at least 2 people. So you understand what Bandra is for Mumbai, right? The Bandra is the posh locality, the rich people live there, and you have a lot of good aura of the place. It's one of the most expensive real estate areas of Mumbai. And there is a beautiful slum there. If you have been to Mumbai, you might have looked upon this beautiful slum. It was painted by a set of artists, all houses in multicolors. Even the internal streets are colored well. It's a beautiful place to be. It's one of the things to be done in Mumbai right now. This place, around 5-6 years back, this was a discussion to convert this entire slum into housing societies. And the land that is generated will be used for government purposes. The government said that let's rehabilitate the slum dwellers into high-rise buildings, and the remaining land can be used for other purposes. So the land use is not very right in not very optimum when it comes to slum. The houses are not of multi-floors. When you move into multi-floor houses, the land use becomes more optimum for the government. The discussion, as it happens in most slum redevelopment projects, was happening with the women of the family, because the decision making becomes simpler for the government to negotiate with. So there was a set of women, around 100 to 150 women, all from the slum. And the women asked for one thing, the one last condition, after which they are willing to move in. The condition was that we would not want a toilet inside the house. We would want a community toilet to be installed, to be there in the buildings. So living in a slum, moving to flats, a full-fledged 2 BHK houses for them. And they're saying, I do not want toilet inside my house. Why this might be the demand from them? Yeah, quick guesses. Yeah, Chaviji, please go ahead.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, Chaviji.
Yes, so the guess is similar to what Pallavi ma'am had. It's because women historically in villages or in slums have been used to open defecation. And while defecating in the open, they have this idea of socializing and getting together within a community. So that translates into an idea of asking for a community toilet.
Okay. But this is a slum. You don't get a lot of time in the slum. You don't get to defecate in the open in the slums. And the time overall, it's actually, when you go to a slum and when you visit a toilet there, it's not very far from their houses. It's very close. It's a very compact area.
Radhika is guessing that toilet considered unhygienic in the house, same community bonding reason. So there is one.
So there is no community bonding reason because there is not too much of time involved. So that we have answered. That was true in the previous example. We will not repeat the same reasoning for this as well. There will be something new for sure. That's the minimum you can expect from the speakers, especially in a fireside chat. Toilets considered unhygienic. That's true. It is considered unhygienic because remember, these people are working in a slum, has been living in a slum for long. When you live in a slum, your rooftop is not very different from the rooftop of the nearby toilet. And mostly your kids will be playing around the same area. So the unhygienic aspect usually reduces when you move to a toilet. Okay, I'm referred that the time is lesser. So
maintenance problem.
Yeah.
Because of water bill.
Yeah. Because of
water bill.
Water. No, water was afforded. So this is Bandra, as I mentioned. Bandra is rich in water. Bandra is rich in money. Bandra is rich in environment. Bandra is rich in everything that is possible in the Mumbai. The water was available. The ratio of toilets reserved for women is much less compared to men toilets. So they were asking for community toilets, and there the question of reservation of toilets is considered. In a domestic household, there is no differentiation between a woman toilet and a male toilet. They're usually the same toilets that people use. The reason was that the women were confused or were anxious about survival. They're living in a slum, and the biggest question that comes in a slum is that will we get to live in this place for long? This is a question of survival in the city. If the flat has a toilet inside, it is likely that the male members of the house or someone in the family would like to sell it to some middle class family and get a very, very high amount, say crores. If the toilet is not inside the flat, no middle class family would want to buy it, and the flat prices significantly reduce. So they get to live in a bigger area. They get to live in an area which is much more hygienic and much more open for their family to live in, and they get to keep the house for life. What is important in these two definitions is that we have a bias towards our own lenses to look at the world. We have a bias to look at the world with whatever experiences that we have. Public policy is about making choices, and that's the crux of policy for me. The choice of criteria, the choice of reasoning, the choice of priorities is what makes public policy one of the most difficult domains and terrains to be in. It is subjective, and it is based on what you think right. And your decision will impact millions of lives. In this session, we will go through various lenses to look at public policy, various ways in which engagements happen with the policy world, with external stakeholders, and look at across different eras of Indian history, how policy making impacts and has impacted the way we look at the government and the way we look at the role people play in the decision-making process of the government. So this was broadly about the way we look at development, the way we look at policy, the way we define policy, and the way we look at policy in our day-to-day life. Going forward, we will be discussing what kind of ecosystem exists to make all these things possible. From the pothole in the road, from the bus ticket, to look at how hand pumps should be installed in the village, to look at how flat allocation should be done. What kind of ecosystem exists around this? And I would like to pass on the mic to Geetika ji to take over and move ahead with the session.
Thanks, Kumar. Yeah, so thank you for setting that context actually about how all of us have different lenses and can look at the same thing in possibly a multitude of ways. Now, public policy is not something that happens in silos with the government acting, right? It consists of this really vast ecosystem which is involved in the policy making process and the policy design, formulation, execution, evaluation. So across the policy cycle, there are multiple stakeholders who are involved. And if I had to liken it to something else, I'd say it's like a chessboard. There are multiple players, and like board pieces, each one of them has a different kind of identity, a different kind of role, and a different kind of power. It's important to note while the government is the only stakeholder which has authority, right? No other stakeholders in this ecosystem will have any authority, but they do have a lot of influence which they're able to put even without having authority. So it's interesting to understand how that kind of plays out. So if we could look at the slide content, I'm not sure that's getting displayed right now. The slide is coming empty.
Yeah, there is nothing displayed on the slide.
Could you just refresh the deck? I think it might load.
Okay. It is, I refreshed, Ritika, it is currently empty. You can go ahead. I think people will just note.
Yeah. I've also sent you the link again. Maybe it's cached or something. Okay. No issues. Let me try to display my side of it.
Should I stop the share?
Yes. Right. So, talking about the public policy ecosystem, like I mentioned, there's a variety of stakeholders, and if we liken them to, players or board pieces on the chessboard, each one of them has a different identity, a different kind of role, and different kinds of powers. So we'll just go around this and look at each of the stakeholders and try to understand their role in the ecosystem, and also see how they influence the public policy landscape in their own unique ways. And at the middle of it all, of course, is the government. Like I mentioned, they have the most amount of authority in this scenario, and they rightfully make policies and are actively involved through the policy process. Within the government as well, this is not unidimensional, right? It's not just one entity making policies. Policies within the government are made via the legislature or through regulators such as TRI. So we have think tanks such as the Niti Aayog, of course, the executive directly making policies. So even within the government, this is really multifaceted. But for the purpose of this discussion, let me also touch upon other stakeholders briefly. So beginning with grassroots organizations. So for any cause that one could think of, there are a bunch of grassroots organizations that are doing great work. They work on the ground with the people. They are actively engaged with the beneficiaries. And their role in the ecosystem is extremely crucial because they are able to amplify the voice of the people like no other entity in this ecosystem. So while working directly with the people, they understand the pain points, the roadblocks, and for them, their power lies in the fact that they are able to voice out whatever is happening at the ground and make it reach to top level stakeholders, be it at the district, to the state, or to the national government. Examples of this would be NGOs such as Pratham, who are doing excellent work in the space of education, but also at the same time are able to influence policy using that body of work, right? The next stakeholder we look at is think tanks and academia. So think tanks, again, while working from a distance from the ground, are still very actively involved in understanding the ground scenario. They look at what's happening on the ground, conduct surveys, acquire data, look at it to try to understand certain trends that are happening in any kind of space. And their influence lies in the fact that they are able to synthesize all of this information extremely well, draw out insights from that, and bring it to the notice of the government in an evidence-based fashion so that there can be uptake for creation of policy through these. Examples of this would be the Center for Policy Research, the Observer Research Foundation, amongst others, who have been contributing to the policy space in India since a really long time. Moving on to special interest groups and industries. Now, of course, anytime any policy is made, it's directly impacting a bunch of beneficiaries. While we kind of always assume normatively it's the citizens on a larger level, this could also be limited to a specific industry. This could be limited to a specific interest group. For example, if we look at TRI, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, making any policy, chances are that there are a lot of industrial policies that come out of TRI as well. So it could be making a policy which is just pertaining to the telecom sector, just operative on those set of stakeholders. So there are industries who are going to be impacted by the policy, who are going to present their views on how that's impacting their operations. And there are also special interest groups where industries band together to present their own concerns, such as we can look at COAI, which represents the concerns of the cellular operators in the country. We can look at IRDI, which represents the concerns of the insurance companies in the country. So we also have these interest groups whose work largely lies at the crossroads of taking an industry perspective and merging that with what the government wants to do in the field of policy in that specific sector. Moving on to philanthropies, and we are recently we've seen this evolve in a big manner. A lot of philanthropies are coming into the picture and contributing to different sectors of policy. They essentially support either NGOs or other organizations working directly in those sectors through funding. And their job then becomes to ensure that the money that they're spending has a high social return on investment, right? And examples of this would be the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, amongst others. And increasingly, their role in the ecosystem is also increasing, because apart from just supporting these funders, these organizations, they're also looking at culling out insights from experiences of their funder organizations, and again, amplifying that and ensuring that reaches the government. And finally, we have policy and governance consulting organizations, which are working closely with the government to help them chalk out how to design policies, how to execute policies, how to evaluate policies. And they bring in a lot of technical expertise and help the government in different kinds of domains. And again, this is something that has evolved big time in the last few years. Examples of this would be organizations which contribute to the policy making process, organizations which contribute to the policy design as well as the execution process, such as Samagra, such as Dalberg, and organizations who are playing a very key role in evaluation, such as JPAL, 3I. So this largely covers the ecosystem we have around the policy landscape in the country. Right. So whenever we look at different sets of stakeholders in policy, it's important that we understand what role each of them is playing. Like I said, they are like board pieces on a chessboard. So each of them is unique, but each of them may not be playing the most important role in each of the situations. So generally, we map the stakeholders in this 4x4 matrix according to their interest in a certain issue, as well as looking at the kind of influence or power they have. Now, we can take the example of the latest national education policy that has come out. And if we try to see in this kind of matrix, what kind of stakeholders, say, for example, have high influence and high interest, please use the chat box and let me know, who do you think has the most amount of influence and the most amount of interest in the national education policy?
Guesses, guys? Anyone?
Yeah. So I see some responses coming in. They're saying parents and students, teachers in schools, private universities, society as a whole. Okay. So think who has the most interest, of course, and who also has the most amount of influence. Okay, so we have a bunch of answers coming in. Education boards, true, very true. Right. So if I was to think about this and see who has the most amount of interest, I think instinctively I'd also say students, but they don't necessarily have the most amount of influence, right? Because as a student, I'm sure you all have some kind of views about the NEP, but if you have to get that across to the government, we really don't have a channel which amplifies that voice and concretely gets it across. So my pick from the options you've laid out would probably be the private sector, private universities, edtech startups, because they are very interested, and just in the way they're organized in the policy ecosystem, right? We saw that there are special interest groups, there are organizations that represent them. It's easy for them to get their policy perspectives across to the government, right? Okay, that's one perspective. Say we look at some, and students and teachers, a lot of you have mentioned, I'd say they have high interest, but low influence. So I'd put them in the other category that way. Let me enable screen share again. Yes, so I'd say high influence, high interest is private universities, edtech startups. Low influence, high interest could perhaps be students, because extremely interested but really no means of influencing. High influence, high interest would also actually be teachers' unions. So while teachers otherwise are fragmented, they have a very, very strong union presence. Actually, in each of the sectors that we see, in any ministry, the biggest constraint to reforms often is the stakeholder which is being looked upon and is extremely unionized. So teachers in this case, for example, if you're looking at the railway ministry, the biggest constraint to railway reforms might just be the railway union, because they have the most at stake, right? So yeah, that is how this entire ecosystem pans out. I think you've gotten the points. In the interest of time, we'll move on. So Kumar, do you want to talk about a GDP again and just touch base on all of the understanding we've gathered till now and bring it together for us?
Would you move to the next slide? Yeah. So the bigger question that it comes to us, and after Gitikaji's question and the map of lands, the stakeholders in the domain, the bigger question that we ask is, do we want a big government that does everything for us? A big government that is sitting on the entire cities, on the entire nation, and moving things for us. And the expectations are very clear. We want the government to invest more in manufacturing. We want the government to increase government expenditure. We want the government to incentivize domestic expenditure. We want the government to promote international investments. We want the government to disinvest PSUs. What is the role of other stakeholders in this? Overall, in this situation, what is our honest expectation from the government? What do we want the government to be doing right now? And is it right to expect everything from the government itself? From the entire set of stakeholders, which includes private players who will assist the government, which includes a lot of philanthropists who anyway invest money and pump money into the Indian ecosystem, which means the development and policy ecosystem, in terms of the entire set of consulting bodies and the private NGO players, which are too many in number in India. Apart from all the local bodies that exist in terms of the private businessman, the big businessman, the MSME groups, the groups of businessmen, the groups of the community, the unions, what do we want the government to be doing? The answer to this comes from the lens again. What do we want the government to be doing? And that answer might come in when we look at history and identify what sort of community and what sort of expectations we have as a group from the government. So the next slides will cover about the past, present, and the future. We have divided the past into 4 blocks, the present as 1 block, and the future into 2 blocks. And we will quickly cover that, as Priyanshi has already given me a hint to start wrapping up the question. So quickly moving on, the past. Kritika, would you like to take it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So in this era, we're largely referring to the and if you comment might unmuted. Yes, we did the
Please mute yourself, guys. Please, anyone. Only Gitika, when she's speaking, let's keep it that way. I will mute everyone. Gitika, continue.
Thank you, Philip.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've muted everyone. Yeah, you can continue.
First era that we're looking at is the 1950s and the 1960s. There we had just come, out of the British rule, just recently gained independence. The constitution had been set up, it was evolving. Policy on the whole was evolving. The orientation that we adopted in this Nehruvian era was socialist, right? So more or less, there was a lot of focus on social protection. Private participation at this point was low. And this is also the time when there was, I think, one of the highest electoral participations we've ever had, because the belief in the concept of democracy was freshly minted and there was just a lot of trust in the government. And the other interesting thing to note from a policy lens is also that there was this was also a time when the 5-year plan started coming around. So the perspective of development was marked out in 5 years each. And the Planning Commission started looking at what kind of a development trajectory they wanted the government to have. So essentially, I'd say that kind of captures this first era of public policy that we mentioned.
Yeah.
Kumar,
this was the beginning, and the second phase arrived with the arrival of Indira Gandhi in the national scenario, and he took socialism to an entirely new level when he moved to what we call in public administration the state-centric paradigm, the paradigm in which the government is expected to be queens, that government knows what they're doing, the government always works in the best interest of the citizens and the administrators, the bureaucrats, might not know what they are doing, but the government knows, which means the legislators know. And the central government and the union government became the sole proprietary of development and defining what is good for the nation. We saw this big news of banks being nationalized. A lot of government units private units were nationalized. There was high central control. The imagination, as I mentioned, that the citizens are pawns and they will act on behalf of the interest of the queen. The queen is the central government. And like in a chessboard, the queen is centrally protected and has the maximum power. That was the imagination of the state. The next major phase came in when we moved to the early 2000s. The early 2000s marked a sharp change in the way governments functioned. The sharp change was suddenly government was measuring its progress. We saw this picture from Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, the first properly measured scheme of the government. The government gave themselves a target. The next 3-4 years, we will increase the enrollment in government schools to this much. So many kids will get educated. And there was a sharp focus on efficiency within the government. So suddenly the government had moved to a good governance paradigm in which the government defined stakeholders. There were a lot of private participation. There were a lot of NGOs, civil society groups who participated with the government, both for awareness drives, both for measuring the quality of education, and a host of other schemes followed, which were all time bound, which were all promised to the citizens that in the next 3 years we are going to do this. And electoral successes started to be based upon the development that they're doing. The electoral promises were based on development. We have suddenly moved beyond roti kapda makan and moved to bijli sadak pani. The fundamental needs were no longer the electoral issues. They were still issues and they were still mentioned in the political speeches, but we have moved from one generation of development to the second generation of development. And the last phase of the past was with the 2011 Anna Hazare movement. This is recent. We've all seen this. This marked a significant change in the way we look at our politicians and bureaucrats themselves. Suddenly, there was a big hue and cry about why do we leave politics to the practice of only politicians. And then we had a lot of professionals joining politics. A lot of people who were not traditionally politicians, they joining politics. A lot of common man, what we may imagine as common man, willing to contest elections and play a meaningful role. A lot of civil society groups came in this period. A lot of NGOs started in this period. A lot of activism movements started in this period. And since 2011, we have seen a significant rise in the way non-government players engage with the government in various means. This entire movement was the fulcrum of a big change in which the government opened up its doors for different and non-government stakeholders to come and participate. That becomes more and more prominent when we come to the present, and the present in the form of what the media likes to call the Modi Rajya, the rule in which one single man is at the focus of the entire governance machinery. If you can move to the next slide, that slide shows the cover pic. The next slide, Ritika ji. Okay, one slide is missing. Okay, the current government, which is known to be a powerful force, known to be a centralized power, very, very efficient in terms of delivery of government promises. So when it comes to delivering Jan Dhan Yojana, when it comes to delivering Ujjwala, when it comes to delivering benefits directly to the accounts of people, it is considered very, very administratively efficient, politically very, very centralized, and still continuing with the old focus of moving towards a good governance paradigm in which there is talk about stakeholders, there is talk about their respective accountabilities, and there is talk about how policy design can be improved. So national education policy saw some open hours in which people could go into a portal and feed in their grievances. The new environmental policy is open for public to go in and put in their comments. We see an increasing engagement in the way the policies get formed. Gitika ji, would you like to add on to it?
Yes.
Gitika, I'll share the screen. Give me a second. Yeah. Give me a second. Yeah. Is that visible?
Could you go to the slide before
It
this?
is.
Yeah. Yeah. There we go.
You have to maximize.
Yeah, I just.
Pallavi, I think my slides again are somehow not a part of this deck. I've just sent you a mail again. If you could just check that out. Till then, I'll just take up the content for this slide.
Sure.
Right. So to the question that Kumar posed to me, like you're saying, the way policy has been, is evolving, but more than that, the method is evolving, the engagement is evolving. So from times when there were stakeholder consultations in privy groups and they would just sample representations for the sake of it, we're moving to a system which is truly representative, because the modes to interact with the government to get your point across have become much larger than they were ever before, and they become much more accessible. So even with this whirlwind of policy that has come around during the COVID era, where we are sitting at our homes in lockdowns, we've still been able to interact with the government and let them know about our views on the environment policy, the EIA, the national education policy. So these are significant developments that have happened. I think that's one point. I think the other point to understand is that when we look at these eras, sometimes we just feel like, oh, there was a particular era, something happened, and that becomes the defining moment or the landmark moment for policy in that era. What's really important to keep in mind is that policies don't just develop instantly, right? These watershed moments just don't come in an instantaneous manner and just change the entire paradigm. Any kind of policy shift is a product of a really long history of systemic change, ideological change, and small pivots towards changing policy and the mindset towards reform. So it's important to keep in mind that looking at any development, you perhaps want to go, T-5 and look at what was happening at that point and how was it possible that at the T point something could develop and foster in that way. So I think that's my input regarding just looking at the policy from a past outlook. Pallavi, were you able to get that deck?
No, actually, I just have the slide which has the PowerPoint related to future social political. That is after Prime Minister's India Today one. So I don't have any other. I'm happy to share that one though. I think maybe a slide or two is missing. But if you want to project this one, I'm happy to do that, which relates to the future. I'll just do it in a second, please. Give me a second. So that's the one. So, yeah. Gitika, this is the one I have after India Today, after Modi ji. This is the one.
Okay, no problem. Let me just go across with the policy points anyway. So we've spoken about the past outlook towards policy. Let's look at the present. And like I just mentioned, any kind of policy change is a product of different things that have happened in the past. So whatever is happening at this moment is also going to impact what happens in the future, which is why it's important to look at the present of policy. And as we all know, the present situation is a situation of crisis. And the crisis is like no other, and the crisis is not limited to a single sphere. We're looking at a humanitarian crisis, we're looking at a health crisis, we're looking at an economic crisis. We've been through a major economic crisis in 2008, but this is nothing like that, because suddenly we're finding ourselves struggling in different domains. In that sense, this is truly unprecedented. And we can see for ourselves in our personal experiences as well that the government is struggling to cope. And the symptoms of this struggle are very evident already. So at the macro level, there's a lot of uncertainty. We have existing systems such as the parliament, which have become dormant. We have the social fabric, which is collapsing. We have the vulnerable groups, which have truly moved towards the edge of underdevelopment again. So all of this population that we brought out of poverty in the last couple of decades, it's, you know, tilting towards going back into that vulnerable zone again. And in this larger backdrop, if you look at the government at a very functional level, like I said, they are struggling because they have a mammoth task ahead of them. Conventional wisdom amongst the government stakeholders is failing. Any solution that is considered has extremely high trade-offs. And I think the most important thing that I have realized working in the policy space is that we have this really popular go-to idea of taking best practices from other countries and then just transposing it to our own country and being like, this is how we're going to pursue development and this is how we're going to change things. But in the current context where things are so rapidly moving and they're so dynamic, even that option is failing us. So currently, the armor of policy options that we have is looking bleak. So in those terms, we are truly at this precipice of a huge crisis. And these challenges have manifested, like I mentioned, in three key areas. The first of which is, of course, health, right? Public health has been laid bare like never before. We're seeing gaps in infrastructure, gaps in manufacturing, production, staffing, and from another social side of things, gaps in access and affordability as well. If you look at the economic side of things, like Kumar mentioned, for the first quarter, for this quarter, the GDP has contracted. We're seeing that there's large-scale unemployment, consumption is going down, and there's only like till a certain point that the government can spend a lot, increase expenditure to give that stimulus, and after a while, even that is going to go down. And the third aspect to look at is fiscal. It's important to realize that this is not just an economic problem, this is also a fiscal problem. Like I said, government expenditure is becoming problematic. While the government has been forced to increase expenditure because of the crisis and to give stimulus, at the same time, revenues are falling, right? Because people are not earning, revenues are going down, industries are suffering. And in the face of that, looking at budgeting for the next year is becoming extremely problematic. So this is our larger context. The government is struggling. The policymakers are looking at themselves and finding their hands tied in terms of health, economy, the fiscal policy. All of these are again struggling a lot. And I know I've painted a very grim picture, and in times like this where it's already so dismal, we don't want to be doing that. But this is a very accurate depiction of what the current times are. But to give you a single ray of hope here, it's also during times of crisis that the most mammoth of changes have come across. So it's not just that we're in crisis and we don't know how to get out of this. It's also an opportunity for us to look at things that we should probably have done many years ago, right? All of the challenges that I mentioned with regards to health, economy, the fiscal side of things, these are honestly not new challenges. These challenges have been there in the Indian society for a while. It's just that COVID has kind of thrown a light on them and exacerbated them to a certain extent. And now we suddenly feel like we're in the middle of a huge problem. But these crises and challenges are there because there have been long pending reforms that have not been executed. And now is the time for us to focus on them and see if that can be done. Some of you may have heard the name of Mr. Arvind Panigrahi. He was the former vice chairman at the country's think tank, the premier think tank, Niti Aayog, and he's currently working at Columbia University. And he said this really interesting statement with regards to the COVID problem. he said that it's going to be a pity to let the crisis go to waste, right? This is an opportunity for us to expedite and do a lot many things. And he puts the end line as the time till the vaccine comes out. And he says that is the time frame till which we have to bring in reforms that overhaul, what the country is looking at, what the policy landscape in the country is looking at this point. But while he said that, and crisis may be a conducive time to bring in reforms, it's also important to remember that just having a crisis is not going to automatically spring reforms. It's no guarantee. So there's a certain kind of approach to seeing what kind of reforms can come about, what kind of areas can be focused upon, and where all reforms would be possible. Because just realizing that there are problems is not adequate. So I'm going
Gitika?
Yes.
So, sorry to interrupt Kumar and Gitika. We just ran out of time. It's already 12 o'clock. And we have lots of questions with us. And we will continue for another 15 minutes with question, with your permission, if you're okay with that.
So I think give me about 2 minutes to wrap up my part.
Yeah.
Let me just give the present perspective really quickly.
Sure.
And Mark can take a couple of minutes to wrap up about the future, and we can just then take the next 1 minute to give our own conclusions. And I think 5 minutes and we should be done.
Great. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Shreyas. So, like I said, there's no guarantee for reforms just because we've been able to realize that there are problems and we see the crisis as a hotbed for having reforms. In order for any kind of reform or any kind of large-scale decision-making to happen, there are 3 things that need to be in place. And for this, I'm referring to John W. Kingdon's policy classic called Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policy. And there's a very interesting article that Mr. Pranay Kostani from the Takshila Institute has written on this. I'll probably send the link in a little while. But he says that there have to be 3 streams. There have to be 3 things which have to converge in order for this to happen, right? So the first thing, of course, is that there needs to be the policy stream, right? There needs to be the problem stream, like I mentioned. We need to realize that there are problems, and there needs to be large-scale recognition of these problems. And there's no time like the present to see what kind of problems exist and need immediate attention. So that is one aspect that's actually been taken care of during this COVID pandemic that we are going through. The other aspect to look at is the solution stream. So while we may have a bunch of problems, if there are no readily available solutions, it's difficult for the policymakers to dive into that problem and be like, let's explore this and let's bring in reforms. Because reforms in itself is such a huge thing. There needs to be literature, there needs to be a lot of thinking perspective from within the country's academia, what kind of solutions can be brought about. And given, like I said, these are long pending reforms, there's already been a lot of thinking, a lot of evaluation on what kind of solutions would work best. So in some sense, we also have the solution stream being taken care of. And the third thing to look at is the political stream. Because even if you have the problem, you have the solution, but you don't have people at the helm of everything. The politicians looking into those and realizing that there are actual problems and solutions that they need to bring together, things are not going to move. So it's important that through global trends, through popular narratives, and through special interest groups, these things are brought to the fore and they become political matters from just policy matters. So I'd say when these 3 things converge, the problem stream, the solution stream, and the political stream, at the confluence of all 3 is when things come into the government's horizon and any kind of reform is possible. And I'd say at the present stage, because these 3 are evolving at a very high intensity, the kind of critical mass that we need for reforms is coming into the picture. And I'd say though things look grim at this moment, as we move towards the future, I see a lot of opportunity for reform and a lot of meaningful policy making. And with that, I'd like Kumar to also shed light on what his thinking regarding policy making in the future is.
Sure. Thank you, Gitika. Gitika has eased my job. She has given you hope. She has given you fear. She has given you a perception, and she has given you the nuance to look at policy. So the next slide will try to converge the different aspirations of policy and try to divide the future into 2 different trends. The first trend is a geo-economic trend, that what kind of geo-economic scenarios might emerge in the future. The second direction, the second axis is about the geopolitical trends. What kind of future economic political situations we can imagine in the world. There are some hypotheses behind this entire simulation. The first hypothesis is that there would be clear lines in between these scenarios. One situation is that there is no clear line. In this analysis, what we're going to do is we are imagining that there would be clear structures that will be formed. In the geoeconomic side, the first big assumption is that there is going to be a great disruption. Similar to the direction of what steam engine did to the world, similar to the direction of what mobile phones did to the world, we are going to see a big disruption in the coming years. This can be in the form of 5G, this can be in the form of some new technology emerging, this can be in the form of the brain chip that Elon Musk is planning. One of these things will work and we are going to see a great disruption. The second geoeconomic trend is that there is going to be a new economic boom, not because of technology, but because some things will just fall in place. There will be pieces of puzzle that will just join in, and there will be a great economic progress, not by disruption, but by linear improvement, but significant linear improvements. The third is via secular stagnation. The world is going to stagnate. The economy is going to grow at the rate of growth that is currently growing, around 1 to 1.5% in the world. And it will continue in the same format, which is the boring linear way. And the fourth, and the fear part comes in the red, is the global recession. You might come across as a global recession. Now this analysis is pre-COVID, and this analysis is only valid from 2022 onwards, when the COVID is gone. Because COVID is likely to change any one of these at any point of time. So this situation is not valid for the COVID era. In terms of geopolitical trends, the 5 directions can be that US will rise back as a sole superpower in the world. The second is that China and US, the currently 2 big control points of the world, will cooperate with each other and will join hands. And with the elections coming in US, it is a likely possibility as well, with the Democrats and the Communist Party deciding to leave apart the differences and cooperate instead of compete. The third possibility is that they will competitive. They will cooperate in some domains and they will compete in some domains. And there will probably be some synergy. And these domains we will work together, and these domains we will work at counter to each other. The fourth possibility is there would be a new Cold War. And what is currently happening is someone similar to that, but US is currently also more popular than and more powerful than China. But if China rises in power and US continues to play the trade war game, there is likely to be a Cold War. And the fifth, and the scenario that I personally bet for, is a multipolar world. It's a world in which we will have more poles than the 2 or 1, and there will be more nodes to control the world in different directions. More regional powers will emerge. Now, in this hypothesis, I am considering that in the next 10-20 years, China is not going to be the only superpower. And this is a hypothesis that I am drawing on. Now, within this, if I look at it, this creates a matrix. And in this matrix, there are n number of things that can happen. I have highlighted 6 particular themes that I feel are more likely for India or more likely to happen as a whole. The first is the new American universe. America will again become superpower. There will be a great disruption, and because of technological disruption and technology, America is at the forefront of technology. Among the top 10 companies in tech, 7 of them are based out of US. And there will be a big change in tech, and there will be a new American universe. You'll all aspire to be Americans again, and the America would be great. And India will have to choose a side, whether to be a close ally of America or a distant ally of America. Being an enemy of America will not be a choice left for us if America is the sole superpower. In a unipolar world, if you are a developing nation, you will have to just decide how close do you want to be. The second choice we have, if it comes to the side of a cooperative G2, in which the 2 countries, the G2, the China and US, decide to cooperate with each other. It will be a time when India will be in a jinx situation, because the 2 have decided to join hands. One will control the West, one will control the East. The East one is a traditional enemy because of land issues with the nation. We are in a difficult spot in that situation. The rush is to gain all resources possible. This is a situation with new economic boom. The rare earth metals will become the new oil, and data is already announced to the world as the new oil. So you will have data and the rare earth metals becoming the new fulcrums of control in the world. And there will be a rush to gain access to it. India has access to both. India has access to a huge amount of data. India has access to some significant amount of rare earth metals. And both the countries would want to gain access to India's market and India's raw materials for their own growth. And India will have a thin line to navigate with. The line will get thinner if there's a cooperative G2, that the countries decide to cooperate on some matters and compete on others. And this comes a time when India will have to eventually build a bloc of its own and come with a power mightier than just one nation. India will have to have friends and allies in both the camps and build a power of their own so that they can ask from things from both the sides. And we would believe that this situation will lead to a secular stagnation. Because both powers each other's power to grow, so they will both each other's growth as well as support each other. Secular stagnation, in which the both powers will like to promote their own development as well as hinder others' development. What we call the traditional trade war. Yes, Sergi.
Sorry, can you wrap up, please?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
We are just above the time, 10 minutes.
I will just take 2-3 more minutes. The next point is about Cold War, and both the countries are hellbound on destroying each other's economy. And then India will have a huge pressure to choose one of the two blocks. There is a likely choice that we all know in this call. And in that choice, India will be at the forefront of this Cold War. At the borders of India will be used to go ahead with this Cold War. The best choice India has is the Delhi dream, in which there is a new economic boom and there is a multipolar world. And the Delhi takes the key stake in this with the access to raw materials, the access to most skilled laborers, and an ideal position in the world. However, more likely situation, as we may predict, is the digital Westphalia, in which we have a disruption in tech disruptions coming in, and you have a multipolar world. To understand the idea of disruptions that we are going through, we would request Geetika ji to move to the next slide, in which we discuss how economic activity in the past has been changed by tech disruptions. And this is a research by ARC, in which they talk about how economic activities changed solely because of a tech disruption in that period. So one disruption came in the form of steam engine in 1800s, then railways came in, then telephone, automobile, electricity combined together make for a huge disruption. Then was a period of stagnation. No new tech formally came in for a large period. And by new tech, I mean a fundamentally new change. There were small innovations happening here and there, but fundamentally something new did not happen. Pardon. And then you had the computers, then you had the internet, and suddenly you have a host of new possibilities in 2020s and somewhere around 2018 onwards. You have blockchain, which promises to disrupt the entire economic models of the nation. You have genome sequencing, fundamentally altering the way we imagine humans to be superior or inferior to other races so far in Earth's history. We have robotics, fundamentally changing the way we work and achieve efficiency. You have fundamentally changing ways of energy storage, in which suddenly you have a smartphone which weighs nothing more than few hundred grams and storage 5000 mAh or 10,000 mAh. You have artificial intelligence fundamentally changing the way we act in this world, and the distinction between human, machines, and all other forms of living bodies are changing. Living or non-living bodies are changing. The future is massive changes. And in all those cases, the world of policy will also need fundamental changes. Where are we gonna see that? And that brings me to the final conclusion slide. And the conclusion slide is deeply inspired from my favorite cartoon characters, Calvin and Hobbes, Geetika ji, and what Geetika ji says, and what the brilliant cartoon says, that do you have your idea for economic revival yet? And the country says, no, we are waiting for inspiration. And the inspiration would be last minute panic. Let's hope that our policymakers and the people of this nation are not waiting for that last minute panic, and we do something better than that. Over to you, Geetika ji. Geetika ji, you are on mute.
Sorry. I think actually I'm going to draw my conclusion from what Kumar has said and very articulately put. We don't want while we want the crisis to trigger a lot of good policy making, what we don't want is rushed policy making. And like he quoted his favorite cartoon, I'm going to quote my favorite parable. It's called the parable of the blind men. It's this story where a bunch of blind men, go to an elephant and try to hold different parts of the elephant, and then give their own conclusions about what it is. Someone holds the trunk and thinks it's something else. And basically the idea that I draw from that in our current context is that a lot of time while making policy, we also look at things in silos, or some particular things that we want to focus on, and make policies according to that. Like Kumar said in the beginning, we just probably have a kind of hindsight. We carry our own biases and put our own development lens to how we want that policy to pan out. It's important to understand that while we are making policy, there are going to be some consequences that, of course, we want to inject, but there are also going to be consequences which are unanticipated and unintended. And there's an entire framework about this, which I really recommend anyone who's interested in policy to read up about. But we need to realize that policy making is vulnerable to unanticipated and unintended consequences. And whenever we're engaging in policy making, however well-intentioned it might be, it could fall prey to this. So whenever you're making policy, look at the byproducts of that policy making and think of what kind of consequences it's going to give rise to, and then go ahead and finally go into the design and the launch of the policy. So I think that's the only parting thought that I want to convey.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Geetika and Kumar, for such an interesting session. Like, we have gone ahead with like 15 minutes, but still we have everybody staying, and everybody has shown so much interest in this session. So we have so many questions with us, but due to the lack of time, we will just take few. And otherwise, like, if somebody has any questions, they can reach out to us, or we will put you in touch with the speakers, or you can directly reach out to them. So the first question, I'll just ask both of you, Geetika and Kumar. You can address 1 minute each. It's a very basic and very important question about the social contract theory. Rohit Venkat Krishnan is asking, government is the only among the stakeholders which has authority. Isn't this fundamentally flawed? Government is or should be an enabler to things being implemented. The path to decision making, regardless of the magnitude of impact, should be as democratic as possible. Why this prejudiced opinion that government is the body of authority? On the same line, there is a question for Geetika, that doesn't inclusion of government as a stakeholder imply a conflict of interest on the government's part, especially given that it has authority to implement policies? First, I will give dice to Kumar, then Geetika will be followed.
Okay. I think when we decided for a democratic setup, we decided that each of us will play a role. The role of a trader would be to trade. The role of a manufacturer would be to manufacture. The role of a service provider would be to provide service. And the role of a politician would be to create new policies for the nation. And that is a division of labor that we agreed upon as a society. If all of us are free individuals and all of us play equal amounts of role, then the entire fulcrum of society, which is based on interdependence, will be lost. So fundamentally, government has to play a pioneer or an important role in the world of public policy. Whether that is the only player or not, I don't think either me or Geetika ji meant that. We both come from players which are non-governmental in nature. We both come from domains, both of our engagements with the government has been not within the government, but as external stakeholders to the government. And I think they play a very, very important role. If you look at this particular slide, in all the 5 pointers, the vision, skills, incentives, resources, and action plan, all of them have a significant role of the external stakeholders that Geetika ji mentioned in the previous slides. Be it in terms of non-profits, be it in terms of think tanks, be it in terms of research institutions, be it in terms of citizen groups, be it in terms of unions. All of them play a very significant role in all 5 dimensions of managing any change, managing any disruption. So government, though, is at the center of creating change, it is not the only player of creating the change. Gitika ji, if you like to add anything.
Yeah, no, I think you've captured what my thoughts on the topic are very well. So I agree with the question that was raised, that the government has to be an enabler. The government has to take everybody's views in consideration. But you have to realize that there can only be one locus of power. It can't be more than that. Right from the beginning, right? You go to school, there is a monitor in the class, he takes the decisions. The school's overall decisions are taken by the principal. So similarly, right, in any ecosystem, there will only be one locus of power. There are other stakeholders in the ecosystem that I spoke about that influence policy a lot. And the fact that they're able to influence policy just goes on to show that the government has given itself that enabling kind of position so that different stakeholders can reach out to the government and give their points of view and influence policy. But imagine if there were multiple people taking decisions, and because we're saying it's a democracy and everybody should have the power to make decisions. But if multiple people start making decisions, there's only going to be chaos. So the locus of power at all points should be one. I hope that answers the question, Shreyas.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pallavi. That answers very well, actually. It
No, sure.
talks about the basics of, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so it answers the basic social infrastructure, how it works. The next question from the Sapin Kapasi and Prajul Patil, both of them are asking about the lobbying infrastructure in India. As like Prajul is saying that I understand the formal lobbying is not defined in India. However, considering the role of capital in lobbying, can we say that in the end it has the one of the highest influence? Why don't we study the role of that? Your thoughts, Gitika. Then we'll move to Kumar.
Yes, I didn't get the last line. Why don't we study the role of?
Lobbying, actually.
Right. Yeah, like the question has been put, lobbying is not formalized in India as of now. But if we go back to the policy ecosystem that I was mentioning, I mentioned this bit about special interest group and industries. And you are right, they do have a lot of power and they do have a lot of influence. But to say that the only reason they have influence is because they have capital is, I feel, incorrect. Because I know lobbying as a word has just been misconstrued a lot. But lobbying also works in ways where it uses very legitimate channels to influence policy, right? If you look at newly emerging sectors, say artificial intelligence, or I think we should take cryptocurrency and bitcoins actually as an example, because there was so much legislation around, there's a lot of court ruling around that rather that happened. And we see that there were, of course, some companies involved which were already in the Bitcoin business. And there was a ruling that came out from the RBI which completely banned Bitcoin purchase and any transactions with Bitcoin rather. And there were these companies which banded together then, formed what we would call a coalition or a lobby, and came together to represent their own interests. They filed a case in the Supreme Court and they were able to legitimately show their interest to the government and show that the Bitcoin transactions can happen in a legitimate way. And that was a very, it's a great example of seeing how lobbying can work in a framework like ours. So I'd say when you think of lobbying, don't look at it in a way that it only involves money under the table and exchange of unfair kind of means to influence policy. A lot of times in emerging areas which are extremely technical in nature, we have a lot many technocrats which are coming in and helping form these lobbies and helping the government frame ethical and fair public policy around these areas. So of course, it's a huge interest group and it has a lot of influence, but I'd say a lot of it is legal and legitimate.
Yeah. Just to add on to Gitika ji, I'll just quote an example that all of you can refer to. When we refer to lobbying, usually our mind comes to the point where we imagine a lot of money power coming into play. And I agree with Kritika ji, money power is one of the lesser important things when it comes to changing policies for the government. The more important part is what kind of stakeholders get represented in those lobby groups. One good example of an organization that does lobbying for social good is Vayam, based out of Maharashtra. There is a good TED talk by the founder Milind Thatteji. It's part of Tribal Maharashtra. Have a look at the TEDx talk. It's TEDx. You can search for Vayam TEDx and you will find that. A good example of how lobbying works in the grassroots for genuinely reaching out and ensuring that the voice of the marginalized and the grassroots villagers reach out to the policymaking authority.
Thank you, Kumar. The last question from Soumya Singhal. So the question, both of you, what do you think about the scope of public policy education in India? How will the provision of public policy education change in the coming years? And with that, you can also give your final thoughts on the topic also. To Shubham, Kumar.
Okay. Policy is a difficult domain to study. It's traditionally a domain that is not studied but lived. Simply because if you just look back at the session, Gitika ji has referred to at least 10 stories of her own experiences in this entire session. I personally would have referred to a similar number in this entire journey. None of this are traditionally part of textbooks or part of formal curriculums in the way policy education is ought to be pursued. Simply because we get a lot of our energies, our enthusiasm, our knowledge from our own lived experiences. So any form of policy education, if you want to pursue, or if you're imagining to pursue, or if you want to create, you should understand that the world is changing very, very fast. And whatever you teach about policy design, policy evaluation, about how you should look at policy, how you should look at government, the role of citizens, anything is changing very rapidly. What will not change is your own lens to look at any situation, your own lens to look at any problem, and your flexibility to change your opinions when the time comes in. So I remember this line told by one of my mentors, is that we are living in a generation where we have a lot of weak thoughts that we hold on to very strongly. Ideally, we should move to a world where we have a lot of strong thoughts that we hold very weakly. The idea to have very strongly well-managed, built opinions and willingness to change them when the time comes in. That is what an ideal spot would be. And that will not require knowledge, but the right temperament. So whenever you go and find out your policy education course, or finding out, creating courses for policy, finding out universities, colleges for policy, try to identify 3 domains and see how that education will help you out in that. Knowledge, because that will fundamentally define the first 1-2 years of your work. Skills, that will define the 2 to 15 years of your life in the policy. And temperament, because after 15 years, when you'll be in a position to actually make a significant impact, then your temperament will define what kind of changes you are going to bring. So knowledge, skills, and temperament, if these 3 things fall into your place or your perspective of policy education, you're good to go.
Thank you, Kumar. Thank you so much. Gitika, over to you.
Excellent advice by Kumar, actually. We need to have a lot of ideas which are strong, but we hold on to them weakly. I think that's going to be my takeaway as well. But coming to the question, I think policy education in the country is something that's going to explode in the next few years. And I don't just mean formal education such as a master's or having public policy concentrations in the bachelor's courses as well. I mean a lot of courses which are more short-term, which are more executive. So I think there have been organizations which have been catering to that. There have been fellowships which have been providing experiential learning opportunities. I personally am associated with the CMGJ, which does a lot of that. I think that is only going to grow because I see that the demand in the country for public policy professionals is at an all-time high. And honestly, with the current situation that we have in place, the COVID pandemic, the appetite for the government to absorb professionals who can give public policy expertise is on the rise. So it's definitely something that's bound to grow. But having said that, I think it also becomes important to understand what kind of public policy knowledge are you consuming, and what is it that you are going to do with that knowledge. A lot of us go into public policy education without really knowing what we want out of it. So I think my sincere advice would be to gather knowledge from the ground up and then build your way into doing some formal education around policy. Because I think nothing will set you up with knowledge as much as grounding in fieldwork, in understanding of how the citizens work, how the government works, is the way that's going to set you up. So I think that is something I feel is the larger direction for policy education in the country, that there's going to be a good mix of a lot of field elements and a lot of theoretical, philosophical elements of public policy. I think that is the balance that policy education in the country is going to strive towards. In terms of parting thoughts, what do I say? I think the learning that I have had through the years, and I think it's again going to correlate to so many things we've said in this session today, is just around having second order thinking. So many times we go in with our own biases, we have our own first principles, and that is where we derive our understanding from. We ask very surface level questions, we get those answers, and then we just sit on our desk and start making policy. Ask second order questions, ask questions about, if you have a certain assumption in mind, always question it. I think that is the best approach to policy making. Anything that you're going to the ground with, assume that it is wrong, question it a lot until you get to the point where you're so amazingly convinced that that is the right answer. Don't give up. And once you are at that point, that is the starting point of your policy journey. That is the starting point of where you can actually do something meaningful and concrete in the policy space.
Thank you so much, Geetika, and thank you so much, Kumar. With that brilliant sum up, we will end our session over here. We are very sorry to not to be able to take all the questions from our audience due to the time constraint, but we are looking forward to see you all for the next upcoming session on the nuclear issue. And please join us for the Pioneer series also in upcoming weeks. And thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kumar and Geetika, once again.
Thank you for
having us. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kumar, Geetika. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you from next week for our Pioneer series. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you.